Good morning and welcome to Glendale City Church today. Good to see you all here, and we wish you all God's blessing and a spiritual blessing for each one of you as you worship with us today. Also a special welcome to those who are watching online. We know there are several who are doing that, and likewise we hope that you are doing well wherever you may be seated at this time. As we start the service this morning, I just want to make a couple of announcements. First of all, in our prayer today, we will remember some people in prayer who have asked for special remembrance. The family of Robin Vandermolen, let's remember them as he passed away recently. And we will let you know if and when we hear a date from the family for the memorial service for Robin Vandermolen. Let's also remember in prayer Evie Salzman, Joseph Chalopoulos, and I'm sure there are others who in their hearts want to be remembered, and we can be thankful that God knows our hearts and he knows what each one of us needs. One other announcement, the Grace Sabbath School class will begin October 23. We're going to try and see how that works out. We hope as many of you as possible will be able to attend. And for those of you who are not able to attend, we will make available a Zoom session so that there can be interaction if you have a question, or if there's something I say that you don't like, or one of the class members say that you don't like, you can protest vehemently via Zoom. So there's your chance. We hope you take it and take it seriously. October 23, usual time, 9:30 in the fellowship hall. With those few announcements in mind, let us bow our heads as we seek God in prayer today. Gracious God, ruler of the vast universe, this Sabbath morning we come to worship before you. We come to fellowship with one another and with you. Some of us seek to do this in the sanctuary. Some of us do this in our homes today. We come to sing, to pray, to read your word. We come to rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who are going through grief or heartache. We come from varying life backgrounds, but we all come today as your children, beloved by you. Some days feel hard for us. We hurt, we struggle, we fight fear, worry, and uncertainty. God, we feel as if we've been running a race with the challenges of this past year. Thank you that in the midst of it all, you have not left us by ourselves. We believe, God, that you are aware of every situation we face. We believe that you are our healer, that you will somehow bring some good out of even the most challenging life experiences. This morning, Lord, we ask for renewed hope in your promise of grace and forgiveness, renewed hope in your soon return to establish a kingdom where peace, love, justice, and equality will reign for all. We pray for those who grieve today. We ask for your comfort to surround the family of Robin Vandermolen. We remember also Evie Salzman and Joseph Chalopoulos and others of us who have on our hearts burdens or prayer concerns. We ask for your comfort to surround all who weep or those who endure physical or mental pain. We pray for the families of all who have suffered or lost loved ones or property through the recent fires, floods, and hurricanes. Help us each to be reminded that we are kept safe in your presence forever, whether in life or in death. We thank you that your ways are higher than our ways, and your thoughts are bigger than our thoughts. This morning we cast our cares upon you, for you know and care for each one of us individually. We love you, God, and ask for your fresh grace as we worship in this sanctuary today. We ask all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Our scripture reading today is taken from selected verses in Psalm 44. If you have your bulletins in front of you, please join with me in the bold print. I will read the light print, and if you don't have bulletins, hopefully a Bible will help you to some degree. We have heard it with our ears, O God. Our ancestors have told us what you did in their days, in days long ago. With your hand, you drove out the nations and planted our ancestors. You crushed the peoples and made our ancestors flourish. It was not by their sword that they won the land, nor did their arms bring them victory. It was your right hand, your arm, and the light of your face, for you loved them. But now you have rejected and humbled us. You no longer go out with our armies. You made us retreat before the enemy, and our adversaries have plundered us. You gave us up to be devoured like sheep, and have scattered us among the nations. You sold your people for a pittance, gaining nothing from their sale. All this came upon us, though we had not forgotten you. We had not been false to your covenant. Our hearts had not turned back. Our feet had not strayed from your path. But you crushed us and made us a haunt for jackals. You covered us over with deep darkness. If we had forgotten the name of our God, or spread out our hands to a foreign god, would not God have discovered it, since he knows the secrets of the heart? Yet for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. Awake, Lord, why do you sleep? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our misery and oppression? We are brought down to the dust. Our bodies cling to the ground. Rise up and help us. Rescue us because of your unfailing love.
Today we're pleased to have with us an associate professor of English at La Sierra University and the author of a book that she wrote and published this year, Wait for God to Notice. If you'd please join me in welcoming Professor Sari Fordham. More importantly, Sari Fordham and I are proud alumnus of Atlanta Adventist Academy. Pastor Mike Kim boos because he was a attender of a inferior academy up the road in Calhoun, Georgia, named Georgia Cumberland Academy, and they were always jealous of Atlanta Adventist Academy, and for good reason, because we had a basketball team, men's and women's basketball team, the mighty Aardvarks. Aardvarks, seriously. We're the Aardvarks because the initials of our school, Atlanta Adventist Academy, were AAA, and so someone was smart enough to figure out that, oh, well, Aardvark has 2 A's, so we'll just be Aardvarks with 3 A's at the beginning. And so it actually kind of started, somebody made a joke, and it ended up being our mascot, and now it's... Well, we did have the speed of the aardvark, the tenacity of an aardvark. I would say that both Sari and I, in our basketball playing, we were not known necessarily for our great basketball skill, but for our tenacity.
Skills are overrated.
Skills are overrated. It's really what's in your heart. It's really the aggressiveness. It's the energy. And she and I played full out basketball.
You know, it's a limited amount of people that say skill is irrelevant.
That's right. Who said you were going to be part of this conversation, John Nielsen? Wait. For those who are online, I apologize, our head elder just decided to start engaging in conversation off screen, but Aardvarks piqued his interest. But anyway, Sari and I have known each other for a long time, and this is actually the first time we've seen each other in over 20 years. And we're Facebook friends and admirers of each other's work on Facebook, but it's great to be with you again and to see you and to really talk about what I probably do have a little bit of built-in bias because of our relationship in the past, but this is truly a book worth reading, and I hope that from the readings and the conversation that we have today that you will do yourself the favor of purchasing this book and reading it for yourself. I think you will find it good for your soul. And one of the things that Sari is willing to do for you afterwards, if you would like to, for those of you who are here, or if you would like to reach out to me, I'll work it and arrange it with you if you're watching online. Sari would be willing to sign what's called a book plate. It's a nice, to call it a sticker is not fair. It's a very nice,
Sticker is okay.
It will nicely adhese into your book with the author's signature. And if you appreciate having authors sign your books when you have the opportunity, I am pleased to have the author's signature in my copy. She's happy to do that for you following the service today. Again, what a great book. And so I want to give you a taste of it and to kind of at least take you through. There's so many good themes that come out of this and more than what we'll talk about today. But one of the themes I hope, or at least a couple that want to bring to your attention as we talk about the book today, that I think fits in the context of our journey with God, our journey with our faith, and I think Sari's story does a remarkable job of coming along with us in that story. So Sari, if you wouldn't mind, maybe start us out with an intro into your story from your book, if you would.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here. I am so thrilled to be here. Is this okay with volume? A little louder? Okay. Perfect. All right. So thank you again for having me here. I'm going to start by reading from the prelude of my book. It'll set up a little bit about what the story is about. And in many ways, once you read the book, you'll understand that this is my mother's story. She died when I was 25. And there was this pull immediately after she died to return to Uganda and then later on to write about our time there. So I'm going to start from the prelude. And it's called Driver Ants. My mother wakes to the sound of rain, not a storm, but a steady slapping of drops against pane. She rolls over, her body weary from the plane and the children and the dust. Although our new house is at the top of the hill, windows flung open to catch a breeze. The air is heavy, and my mother realizes with a start that she's in Uganda. Fully awake, she sits, pulling one leg against her chest. The room is a watery gray, and the mosquito net hovers over the bed like a wraith. Next to her, my father is stretched out, snoring. Something feels wrong, and so my mother turns and looks out. The window faces a jungle. The branches reach toward the house, nearly scratching the glass. She hears the rain, but cannot see it. Gary, she says. My father answers. Gary, she says again, nudging him. Is it raining? My father listens to the distinctive patter of water hitting glass. The rhythm is constant, lulling. I guess so, he says, reaching out to pull her toward him. It does that sometimes. Perhaps he is tired, or perhaps he has not been in the house during any of the afternoon showers. Neither of them would have made this mistake later. They will learn to know the thickness of rain on a tin roof, the overwhelming timpani of it. But it doesn't look like it's raining, my mother insists. She might be new to this place, but she knows rain. Laughing, my father sits and looks out the window, and he has to agree. It doesn't look like it's raining. They sit together in silence, listening. The noise grows no louder, no softer. It is both constant and close by. My father untucks the mosquito net and swings his bare feet to the ground. He will later be glad he got out on the side that he did. Hands outstretched, he feels his way over to the wall and flips on the switch. A single bulb hangs from the ceiling, casting a waxy glow across the room. My parents gaze down, their stare a mingling of horror and curiosity. A column of driver ants, 6 inches wide, streams across the floor and marches purposefully out of the bedroom and into the rest of the house. The trail begins at their window, where the ants have been boiling out of a slit in the screen, dropping from the ledge, landing with small plops. Driver ants are not interested in picnic fare, in cake crumbs or bits of bread. Mostly they eat lizards, cockroaches, millipedes, geckos, scorpions, frogs, chameleons, baby birds, anything that cannot get away. They are partial to chicken coops. They can eat through a trapped hen, leaving behind bones as clean as porcelain. There are even stories of driver ants chomping through a tied-up calf or goat. With as many as 20 million in a colony, driver ants are more organism than individual insects. Their nest, when they stop, is a living thing, a churning rope of ant linked to ant. They wait only for the queen to lay eggs, and they pick up and leave once again. No plot of jungle can sustain their appetite. When they move, they can cross the road for a week. My parents follow the trail as it winds down the hallway. My father giggles like a schoolboy. He has heard about these ants, how expatriates have sat in the wrong swath of grass and had to high-step it for home, how the most prudish of missionaries will become a clothing Houdini, leaving behind a shirt here, a pair of trousers there. This is the first time he has seen them. Look what you brought, he whispers. My mother does not know whether to be amused or dismayed. The trail of ants turns and travels into my room. My parents walk faster, but I have not cried, and so they don't worry. The worst they expect is that the ants will have surrounded my bed, that they will have to step over the trail and rescue me. When they turn on the light, I stir beneath the blanket. A river of ants cuts across the floor and straight to my bed. It moves up the thin quilt, journeys over the bump I create under the covers, and continues down the other side. Only a piece of cloth separates me from a churning mass of mouths. Somehow the ants have failed to peg me as food. They flow over me, unconcerned, as over a rock or a log. I am lying on my stomach, both hands tucked at my side, the blanket pulled to my ears. It's a wonder I have not kicked off the covers. The air is thick as honey, and I am used to cool, finished nights. If even one hand was flung over the edge, I would have been found. My parents do not try to make connections between what has happened and what could happen. They do not see the ants as a warning that peril can slip in through the smallest of openings, that Uganda is too dangerous, that we should pack up and leave. Nor do they see my escape as a miracle, a sign that we are supposed to be here, that we will be protected. They are not seeking metaphor or prophecy. They are too practical. The ants have given them a scare, but they do not consider them a threat. There are too many other dangers out there. My mother eases me from under the covers. As the blanket moves, the ants spread like a blooming flower. She pulls me clear and stands up straight. There you are, she says. I blink in the sharp light.
How old are you when you're asleep under the driver ants?
I'm very young. I'm not yet 2.
Okay.
So I chose to tell it from my mother's point of view, which is the only way I have access to the story is my parents, because obviously I don't remember this, so I was more interested in following their journey.
And so much of the story is told from the letters, most that your mother wrote back to her father, that helps you put together the story of your time in Uganda.
Yeah, I should say that this was taking place in 1970s Uganda. My parents went there as missionaries when Idi Amin had been dictator for quite a while, and this was pre-internet, so they went without a lot of trepidation because they hadn't done a lot of research. So while everyone else was fleeing Uganda, my parents flew in, my father first, and then my mother stopped with us in Finland, which is where she's from, and then she came a couple months later, and they just came. And it is, with a tremendous amount of trust in the church. I think my parents generally felt like if it's dangerous, the church won't be sending us. And so they came there, and so we were in Uganda for the end of, not at the very end of Idi Amin's dictatorship, we did eventually leave, but we were there for a good part of the end of his dictatorship.
Okay. And what was your father was the official missionary, even though it was a family affair, and what was your father's work there? What was he doing?
So they had a missionary certification program at Bugema College. It was kind of a teaching high school, and so the church was thinking it'd be really nice to make it into a college degree program. So they asked 15 people to go and turn this college certification program into a degree program, and all 15 people very wisely said no. Then they asked my dad, and he's like, this sounds fantastic. So it was only later that he found out that he was not the first choice. He assumed when he was asked that he was, you know, their first choice. But he wasn't a university teacher, he was a pastor. And so he had to, you know, hit the ground learning.
So what was day-to-day life there for you? One of the romantic parts of your telling of the story is the house on the hill. Living on the campus, what was day-to-day life like? Your dad was obviously working at the school, developing the program, teaching.
Very busy.
Talk about what it was like for your mom, you and your sister, as you guys lived day-to-day lives there in the house on the hill and on campus there.
It's really incredible. Right next to the campus was a small patch, a habitat, a wild habitat, and the house was up at the top to catch the breeze. But all around our house was still a thriving ecosystem. So we would have civet cats, we would have monkeys, we would have mongoose, all kinds of snakes. It was very well known for the mambas. My mom would open the oven and a baby mamba might drop out. So we would have pythons that would digest their meals on our, right next to our veranda. They would come out into the grass. And it did not end well for the python, I have to say. That python later went with me in 4th grade to show and tell. And so in some ways
not as a living pet.
No, not as a living pet. But it was in many ways a very ideal childhood, if you could say that. We had no TV, we had a radio where we got Voice of America. But for the most part, my sister and I would scramble around in the jungle. There were all kinds of animals. We would go into the jungle and get pets of chameleons. We would have lots of animals. And our friends would come up the hill and play with us. And it was very kind of idyllic when we were older. We were there up until I was 7. When we were older, we would go each day to collect milk, and we would take a big jerry can down the hill, and you know, all the kids would do it, and we'd line up our milk cans, and then we would play for the 2 hours as, you know, because the milk might be milked at one time or another time, and so the kids were just sent. They could wait as long as they needed to. So it was great. While we waited, we would ride cows, we would play games, we would talk, and so it was a really kind of gentle childhood in many ways.
So from your memory and your experience, this was a very for the most part, very wonderful, from your recollection, from what you pulled from your...
For the most part, yes. I will say food was a constant thought. My sister, when she would leave the table, she would tell us, if she was going to the bathroom during a meal, she would tell us, don't eat my food while I'm gone. And when she came back, she would check, because there's tremendous food shortage that impacted even us. And I was very used to seeing machine guns growing up, so because of military checkpoints. But beyond those 2 things, it was, you know, it was lovely. And my mother's, you know, was very worried about snakes. That would be the 3rd issue. For me and my sister, it wasn't a problem, but for her, Finland doesn't have a very poisonous, there's just one snake in Finland that's poisonous. So it was very shocking for her to land in a house surrounded by jungle to see vipers and mambas and pythons and cobras that spit. It was a very vibrant snake population.
So while your childhood was relatively idyllic, as you said, the reality of what your parents were aware of and what was actually happening in Uganda was something quite different. What can you share about the dangers that were actually facing you, your family, what the school faced during the time of Amin's rule there? What were some of the things that, now that you're aware of, that was actually happening while you were playing with the cows and waiting on milk at the dairy?
It was a hard time. A lot of people would disappear. That was sort of not only like a violence against people, but also a psychological warfare, where one day someone, your brother, your uncle, your father would just not come home and you would never hear anything. And so the women would be going to the government and trying, going to various prisons, trying to find the men in their lives. And I remember Idi Amin once got on the radio and it was like, ladies of Uganda, do not blame the government when your husband runs away, when he's, cheating on you, when he has another family. This kind of next level gaslighting. While we were there, the crocodiles were very fat and indifferent because so many bodies were thrown into the lakes and the streams. It did not go. I remember hearing about a missionary that was trying to take pictures around one of the lakes with the papyrus, and someone told them, just keep going. This is not a good place to stop because that's where the bodies were being thrown. That was one of the places. So it was definitely a bad time for Jimmy Carter's first diplomatic crisis was he had a press conference and he mentioned Idi Amin in a throwaway comment. It wasn't a planned comment in the press conference. So while we were there, all the Americans were placed under house arrest. And so Jimmy Carter's team was scrambling and they said, what an embarrassing first crisis. There's a much more punchy quote that Jimmy Carter's aide gave about this. So then they had to figure out what to do. There were only about 200 Americans. Americans were told not to be in the country, actually. We went anyway, but there wasn't an embassy in Uganda at that time, a U.S. embassy. So we were under house arrest. My mother was a Finnish citizen, so she was not under house arrest. And my father was in Kenya, so he was not under house arrest. And we were the only Americans on the campus of Bugema at that time. So we did have somehow the records were great because we had a soldier come up to the hill. We knew about the house arrest already and came to figure out what things we owned, which was sort of ominous, separating. And so my mother was very much like, this is the schools and what belongs to the Americans, because the implication being your things will not be yours for very long, but why is that? Will you be killed or will you be kicked out of the country? The smart money was kicked out of the country, but there was just enough uncertainty there that even my father in Kenya was concerned. He didn't know whether he should come back into Uganda and be with us in house arrest or whether he should stay in Kenya. So, and that was before the Adventist Church was banned. That happened later, that the Seventh-day Adventist Church was banned. So the school had to shift overnight into a secular school on paper. So for a ministerial program, that was a challenge that it was now a secular, non-Seventh-day Adventist theological program. And so my dad's lesson planning got much more difficult because suddenly all his classes in the middle, talk about, we had the pandemic, we had to shift overnight to online classes. They had to shift from, Greek and Hebrew classes to, physics and biology. His curriculum changed like that.
Yeah, you and I, when we were preparing for this talking the other day, you talked about how we had always heard growing up about a time when in the United States we would be in a time where we were worried that the government might shut down Adventist churches, and you said, well, that happened in Uganda. That was actually, you lived that experience of seeing the government shut down a church and ban that religion from practicing.
And I wonder if in the U.S., what the churches here were feeling, was this the time of the end, or was this an event that just happened in another country, so it was inconsequential to Adventism in general. So I cannot speak, of course, from what the response was in the United States, or how many people in the United States knew that the Adventist church was banned. But certainly in Uganda, it was a church building event. The Adventist church really grew during the ban. Adventist theology and time events certainly became very meaningful for people who had heard about them. And we were allowed to have gatherings at weddings and funerals. And so they always included baptisms as well. And a lot of people were baptized in bathtubs as well. But the church really grew during when it was illegal to meet.
One of the things that I loved about your book, and it was just, you know, even though you were in an entirely different part of the world, it was, your childhood still sounded a lot like mine in some ways, and growing up Adventist. You know, at least people our age and generations older than us, growing up Adventist culture is remarkably similar no matter where you lived. And, you know, so talking about having haystacks for dinner. If you're an Adventist, you know what haystacks are. If you didn't grow up Adventist, you may have no idea what that is. It's taco. It's like a taco salad. It's like Fritos, and then everything on top of it. But you say haystacks to an Adventist, we know exactly, and we all drool. It's just the best meal ever. We grew up listening to the Heritage Singers records, in fact, you probably don't know this, that we had a children's choir at this church that sang with the Heritage Singers. There's actually a Heritage Singers album with some of the kids from this church singing with them. Yeah.
That's big.
It's pretty, yeah, it's like big time,
That's
because
big
Heritage
time.
Singers were big times. I
Yeah.
mean, they were like big Adventist celebrities. And so if you could be,
Stay at your home.
This is John Nielsen again, for those of you online. John Nielsen is, say that again, John?
They stay at your home.
Oh yeah, you could, if they were traveling through town, people would sign up to have them stay at your home. That was like a big deal. It was an honor to have someone from the Heritage Singers stay in your house. It's true. This is Adventist culture, big time. And then for kids, playing games on Saturday, especially during summer when the Sabbath hours are long and you're bored because you're supposed to be not doing secular activities on Sabbath. So you would take all your normal games that you would play and you'd make them Bible games. Like freeze tag would become memory verse freeze tag. And of course, everyone would quote Jesus wept, because that's a memory verse. That's one verse in the Bible, and that would get you unfrozen. Anyway, Sari talks about those kinds of experiences in her book. And there's one passage, one chapter, where you talked about, though, something that was actually very serious to you, that was very real to you, and that was expecting the soon return of Jesus. And you write about something that you did very regularly as you were expecting. There on the house on the hill in Uganda, expecting the return of Jesus.
Yeah, I want to respond a little bit about writing about Adventist culture. I'm a big reader, and I've certainly read a lot of books from the Pacific Press, and we have a great literary tradition within the Adventist Church. But when I went to my library or went to the bookstore, I never saw myself in any books. You could see people, stories about someone who happened to be Catholic or someone who happened to be Baptist, or, whichever faith background, but you wouldn't read Adventist stories. You wouldn't go to the public library and check out a book and the character was Adventist. It felt in some ways that we were like this secret people, certainly within the library tradition that was near and dear to me. So when I wrote this book, I really wanted it to be published by a non-Adventist press, so it was published by Etruscan Press. I wanted non-Adventist readers to be able to enter into an Adventist story. So if you read it, you'll realize that the second or third chapter is explaining Adventism to a wider audience who are Adventists. And as I was writing, something that's very expensive in literature is song lyrics. So if you're putting song lyrics within a book, you have to pay for the copyright of the lyrics. So when you're writing, you generally try to not include, you can include the title of the song, but not the lyrics. But for this book, I had to include lyrics. I feel like a big part of the Adventist experience is those songs. How do I give thanks for the, the Del Decker songs, or the Heritage Singer songs, or the hymns that we sang? And so that was an expense I was willing to put upon my publisher, was to include lots of lyrics, because if you're going to write about the Adventist experience in the 70s and 80s, it's also a deeply musical experience, and I wanted to capture the texture of the food, that texture of being an Adventist and what we read, what we ate, but also the sounds of Adventism. And there's a little bit about it in this chapter I'm going to read. So as a kid, I took very seriously this idea of, Jesus is coming soon. Everyone talked about it. But I was observing that not a lot of people were paying attention to watching out for Jesus' return. Like, who is out there, keeping watch? And so I decided, I know who's going to keep watch for Jesus' return. It is going to be me. So I'm going to read this short chapter called Waiting for Jesus to Come. And I will say that my decisions to wait for Jesus to come had a lot to do with Sabbath hours. When I had less to do, I was watching for Jesus to come. When it was non-Sabbath hours, I was a little less attentive. But of course, I assumed that Jesus and I were buddies, and he wasn't going to come on a day that I wasn't alert to the event. It was Sabbath afternoon, and I was waiting for Jesus to come. The day was bright and beautiful. Glorious, my mother would have said, despite herself. The frangipani tree was covered with creamy yellow flowers, and swallows were chattering under the eaves. Above the jungle, white clouds billowed. Maybe it would rain later today. We were all waiting for the dry season to break. Or maybe Jesus would come. I searched the sky for the right cloud. The second coming would begin like this, a cloud that looked at first like a man's hand, would draw nearer and nearer until finally we would see Jesus sitting on his throne surrounded by angels. I sat on the veranda steps and looked at the sky, my fingers peeling at the moss that grew in the crevices. The porch was in a pool of shade, and the cement felt cool, almost damp through the cotton of my hand-me-down shorts. The branches that my mother had once paid Samson to cut down had mostly returned, and she knew better than to have them cut again. The shade was a welcome commodity, her words, and the snakes would find their way into the house regardless, didn't she know? Samson had tried to tell her, but she believed in being proactive. My mother now believed we were at the mercy of God, and God, she told us pointedly, expected people to use their common sense. It wasn't common sense to take children into danger, and yet here we were, back in Uganda, living in the house on the hill. Trust the democratic process, my father says. It takes time. The democratic process, my foot, my mother said. My parents' disagreement became the backdrop of our ordinary life. My mother boiled water in the mornings and set it to cool. My father dashed about the house looking for his Bible commentaries, his stack of student papers. My mother gathered up what he needed and handed it to him as he careened out the door, always late. Watch out for snakes, she called. With my father gone, our mornings slowed. We ate breakfast and had worship on the veranda. And my mother read from Psalms, even the ones she might take issue with. Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. Serve the Lord with gladness, come before his presence with singing. My mother didn't hide her feelings. We knew she worried about civil war on the horizon, about military checkpoints, about snakes and malaria and iron deficiency. We knew my father didn't like making mountains out of molehills, and that relative to human history, most anything we faced was a molehill. Their openness made their dispute boring news. Also boring their love and commitment toward each other. I felt fully secure in the permanence of my family. The only thing more dependable was God. We prayed before meals and after worship. Everyone we knew did the same. And because most of our children's books were religious, everyone we read about also prayed and worshiped a Seventh-day Adventist God. I believed in God with the same certainty that I believed in the sky and in gravity and in music. Stories about doubt were confusing. Nothing was more certain than God. Since Vacation Bible School, I had been particularly attentive to the Second Coming. My favorite hymn was Lift Up the Trumpet, and when I heard the opening chords, a martial, bum, bum, ba-bum, I would stop squirming beside my mother and stand straighter, ready to belt out the lyrics. Lift up the trumpet and loud let it ring. Jesus is coming again. Take heart, ye pilgrims, rejoice now and sing. Jesus is coming again. It was after we moved back into the house on the hill that I noticed how blue the sky was, how evocative the clouds, and I began watching for Jesus to return. I would sit for 5 minutes one day, 10 another, and then I would go weeks without searching the sky. During this time, my mother spoke often of heaven. While we had been living in Kenya, my grandmother had died. My mother found comfort in what she called the beautiful resurrection morning. She would, in the hazy future, be reunited with her mother, and she spoke about that day with the same assurance she spoke about our coming shipment of supplies. She was not expecting heaven now, of course, and if she knew her daughter was watching for Jesus, she might have been concerned. We were a religious family. We were not fundamentalists. The difference was in how literally you took the word soon. On Sabbath, everyone said reflectively that Jesus was coming soon. Fundamentalists planned accordingly. A troop of monkeys chased each other on the edge of the jungle. When they leapt from a tree, the branches swung back and forth. It was a movement of leaves I saw more than actual monkeys, until they finally congregated on one of the branches and began to groom each other's fur. I looked at the sky. Clouds hovered over the horizon. I held up my fist to measure them. The clouds were much too small. I wondered if I should look instead for a chameleon in the jungle. We hadn't seen any since we'd been back, and I was anxious to have one as a pet. If I got up, I wouldn't be able to keep an eye on the clouds. Chameleons were hard to find. Jesus' return felt as likely. My father walked up the road just as I was about to give up on it all, in both Jesus and in chameleons. If my father was here, fun would follow. Maybe he would play a Bible board game with us or read stories. We held hands as we walked into the house.
The idea of facing food shortages, facing uncertainty about whether you'll be kicked out of the country, whether the school will be shut down, and the very reality of Jesus is coming soon, not fundamentalist soon, but faithfully soon. There's that kind of, I don't know, like, and your mother's hope in the resurrection morning after the death of her mother. The comfort in the hope, the continued expression of the hope in the face of very dark realities, that admirable, and also, but also you could also see that there were times where the hope would give way to frustration and resignation or doubt. In fact, the title of your book, Wait for God to Notice, that comes from your mom's, and from one of the letters she wrote to your dad. What was that about, and what was she? Where was that coming from for her, and what was that saying when she said, "We're waiting for God to notice"?
So, after my mother died, at some point, my sister and I went to Finland, and we met up there. My aunt lives there, and she took me up to look at my grandfather's things. He had recently died, close to about 95 years old. But she said, "We're going to look at his things." I wasn't sure what to expect, but what she brought out was a stack of letters my mother had written my grandfather in Finland while we were in Uganda. And so I had all these letters, and I could look through them and see the pictures I had drawn and the things my sister had written, but I don't speak Finnish. And so it was all in a language I couldn't access. So I later had a poet friend of mine, Shana Youngdale, who translated the letters. And what interested me is there were a lot of underlined sections of the letters, and my grandfather was an incredibly pious man. He was a pastor in Finland, Onni Mättinen. My mother grew up as a pastor's child. And so my assumption was that all the underlined sections were when my mother had said something particularly spiritual, because I think my mother disappointed my grandfather a little bit, that she was more practical and less, continuously devout. And so I expected that he underlined the sections where his daughter finally said something that he was like, "Yes, I'm going to share this section." And so it really touched my heart. I felt like I got to know my grandfather just a little bit. The underlined sections were all the sections where things were the hardest for us in Uganda. So when he was worried, when she was worried, when someone had been tied up and burned, he would underline that section. Or if there was a carjacking close to our house, he would underline that section. So I felt like I was like, oh, my grandfather also experienced doubt, which is not something I had ever known or considered that he might have done. But my mother wrote to him, and she wrote very frustrated. This was when we came back to Uganda after Idi Amin's dictatorship, and the economy had been bad under Idi Amin, and it was really bad afterwards. And the kinds of things that women are worried about, sure, we're worried about the health of our kids, whether they get malaria, is a husband, father, brother going to be killed, childbirth. I mean, there's so many issues, but on top of all that are the kitchen table issues. The pandemic has set up some of the themes of this book very well. We know what it's like to go to a store and try to get toilet paper. Well, toilet paper was available in Uganda. People are making something like 50 cents an hour, and one roll of toilet paper, I'll let my mother say what the cost was. So this is from one of her letters. "We just found out that the price of one roll of toilet paper is $5, and its size is not enough to use a dozen times. I've read that the sellers rarely have bananas and beans. Wait for God to notice. We remember you all with love in our prayers." And my mother had grown up in post-war Finland, which was a much it was a much bleaker place than Scandinavia is today. My grandmother was an orphan, and she would watch her family's cows, and she didn't have shoes, and so to keep her feet warm, she would stand in cow dung, and she told her kids, go to America where even the telephone poles are taller. So we have this family that, and so that's why my mother went to school in America, and the assumption was you must marry an American man so that your kids will be American, so they'll have options. So my mother did very much know about poverty, but the poverty she saw in Uganda was different than the poverty that she had grown up with. And the easy faith about God will provide versus one roll of toilet paper, the dignity, the indignity of not being able to afford toilet paper, the concern of not being able to buy beans and rice or bananas for your kids at the table, even though bananas are the most plentiful food. And just woman to woman, my mom was so frustrated. Where is God? I mean, beyond the violence of Idi Amin, beyond the violence of the Civil War, beyond the crocodiles being rich in the river, not rich in the river, fat in the river because of the bodies that came in, but beyond the dam constantly stopping because so many bodies were thrown in. Besides all the gruesome violence, the day-to-day hardships that people experienced and that even bled over to our very privileged family as missionaries. Wait for God to notice. And it really felt, while we were there the whole time, this, where does God put his attention? And that's in tension, of course, with the tremendous, faith that you have in Uganda. At that time, more people were becoming Adventists. Because when life is hard, you turn to find meaning in life. And so the value of faith in one way is in contrast with the bounty of God's promises. And where do you find the line? And so this was, I think, a very hard thing for my mom when she was in Uganda. And I think there's a tremendous amount of guilt, too, because she wanted to get us out of there. And my dad would always tell her, do you think your life is, I don't know that he said it as much, but the assumption was there, is our kids' life more valuable than the lives of people who are Ugandans? And so, but that's not the job of the mother to weigh lives. The job of the mother is to protect your children. So the whole thing was very complicated, and it left her really asking, demanding answers from God. And when is God going to notice Uganda? When is God going to notice something? When you talk about the sparrow falling and God notices, when is God going to notice the price of toilet paper, which is $5 a roll? And it seems like a really trivial thing to care about. And yet, we all know how the trivial things can be something we think about. $5. Think of how you work all day just to get enough money to buy one roll of toilet paper. So you don't buy toilet paper, of course. I mean, why would you? But that lack of dignity.
And that becomes, how does that not become such an existential crisis for anyone who believes in a loving God, who believes, like you said, a God who sees the sparrow fall and is completely silent. This is the contrast between what your faith says God is and what you're actually seeing is huge. Another disconnect is the image of God's church, the church that is always God's chosen people, and so you have an expectation with the Seventh-day Adventist Church that there's that the people within it and the leaders within it will operate according to the high calling with which God has called it to be. And one of the recurring parts of your book is the frustration. And it came up in that passage that you read, and the little bit of different feeling between how your father viewed his relationship with the church and your mother's view about things. Talk a little bit about this love of the faith and the challenges with the organization.
Yeah, there was a carjacking that happened to one of the bigger denominational workers who had come in from Kenya, where things were very safe. He had come to Uganda. His car was carjacked with guns, and they were, not killed, so they were fortunate. But after that, everyone started canceling in Kenya their trips to Uganda, and my dad was laughing in his letters. carjackings happen all the time. It just happened to have happened to someone who was Seventh-day Adventist and was high up in leadership organization, so nobody then wanted to come. But my mother would go and ask, when we were in Kenya, can you reassign us? And she did this only once, actually. She went to someone who was half finished and she asked, you know, I have 2 daughters, is it possible to at least allow us to stay in Kenya? And
I'm going to share this mic.
yeah. So she asked, could I stay in Kenya with my kids? And she was chewed out by the individual. Can you hear me? Hello? There we go. So she was chewed out by someone for having little faith. The idea was that missionaries need to have, you know, God will provide, God will take care of you, God will give you protection, and to question the wisdom of having a family in Uganda at that time was not only, she was told, was not only insulting to people who are Ugandan, but also is insulting to God that missionaries have such little faith. So she had been really angry with my father right up until then. And when she came back from this meeting and his boss had told her, your faith is embarrassingly small, she complained to my father, and he was like, you know, that was not fair to tell you that. And he took her side, at least emotionally. And I think that really helped my parents be able to return to Uganda as more of a united front. That my mother felt like she was her concerns were at least seen and understood by my dad, even though he called them a molehill. He was at least able to say that her faith was not compromised and she was not uncaring about the challenges that Ugandans were facing. So there was a lot of tension with that. But you can find, there's a chapter in the book where my mother, she writes to her father very angrily about her experience with Adventist bureaucracy. And it was noted by my grandfather. And I thought it made me really see my grandfather as someone who was more willing to be questioning than I had ever assumed he was as a child. You know, we know and we don't know the people in our lives. That's a reoccurring theme in my book. You know and you don't know your parents very well. You know them, and then there's all these layers of complexity that they have that you don't know them. And so in some ways this book was about being an Adventist, and I'm going to certainly finish reading about that Adventist journey that I took, but it's also a book about finding out who your parents are, and particularly I was investigating who my mother was. So it was no surprise to me that my mother was someone who asked hard questions. You know, as a daughter, you know that about your mom, who was a little bit rebellious against authority. But some of the other things that I learned as I was researching my book, I couldn't, of course, just call her up and ask her, but some of the things I learned really helped me understand and know my mother better. I don't know if you want me to read this last chapter or...
Let me say one thing, and we'll wrap up. I think this is what I love, and what Sari will. Oh, thank you, Jonathan. That's Jonathan Nunez, by the way, AV extraordinaire. Nice shorts, by the way. Is this the reality of your story, of your family's story, and ultimately it also becomes your story, is this love of God, of faith, of service, at the same time with an awareness of deep problems, deep challenges, real doubts that don't have answers, that don't get solved. this is the journey of your family's life, even beyond the time in service and missionary work, and has been the journey of your life to this point as well. And I appreciate how that comes through, and I appreciate and how you frame it in this reading that you're going to share here.
Someone asked me after the book was out how I felt, how I thought other missionary kids would feel reading this book, and I hadn't thought about that audience when I was writing, but it was important to me to observe my experiences honestly and as carefully as possible. Not the experience I thought I had, but the experience I actually had. Where is that honesty? And so I hope that I did other missionary kids well by telling a story that's more complex, that without as much resolution as we might be comfortable with. The story is resolved, but some of the big questions aren't, because big questions are big questions because they don't have easy resolutions. So here is kind of the turn. So I went back to Uganda several times. I was an intern for ADRA Uganda, and then after I was working at La Sierra, I returned again. How could I not go back to Uganda? When people ask me where I'm from, you know, I think about the red roads of Uganda. I think about, there are certain smells that bring me home like no other, even though I'm not, you know, I can't claim Uganda, but certainly Uganda has helped shape me into who I was. So I would return and return again because Uganda is, you know, drawing me to it. So when I returned the second time, I had all kinds of troubles in the morning getting to Bugema. I was staying in Kampala, and Bugema's about an hour away. So I arrived at church late. I was a little frantic, you know, I'd had some issues. And so I was sitting at the back of the church, and, you know, I hadn't been paying as close attention to the sermon as I should. I have a section about what I was thinking about, and then we have the closing hymn. The closing hymn was "Shall We Gather at the River?" How many times had my parents sung this song in this church? I shared the hymnal with the young woman beside me, but I didn't need to look at the words. I knew them through all the stanzas. Shall we gather at the river, the beautiful river? Gather with the saints at the river that runs by the throne of God. Oh, how I hated this song as a child. It was sung during baptisms, those long, excruciating affairs. Somewhere along the way, though, the hymn had grown on me. Shall we gather at the river? It was the hymn's sincerity I liked, the old-fashioned earnestness and hope. After my grandmother died, my mother's faith in the resurrection deepened. She found comfort in heaven and the certainty that she would one day be reunited with her mother. But when my mother died, I felt scrambled. For the first time, I really considered the logistics of the resurrection. I could no longer imagine a cloud of angels floating through the atmosphere and arriving on earth. I could no longer imagine the ground breaking open and bodies emerging from their graves. I didn't know what I believed anymore. I was an Adventist who read the Bible and prayed, whose faith was her most important identity. Yet I also lived with doubt. Do you still believe in heaven? I asked my sister. Of course, she said. Don't you? I don't know. I couldn't say more. I held my end of the hymnal, and my voice united with those around me. Soon we'll reach the shining river. Soon our pilgrimage will cease. Soon our happy hearts will quiver with the melody of peace. Our words were a river. The music was a river. As I sang, I didn't feel sad. I felt held by my childhood faith. And even though I still doubted, I knew I belonged to this church, to this specific building certainly, but also to my peculiar religious upbringing.
Sari, Fordham, everyone. Let's sing that song together as we close today. Shall we gather at the river? Let us stand and sing that hymn together. As always, thank you for your continued support of the ministry of Glendale City Church through your tithes and offerings. Those of you who are here on campus, you're welcome to give in the baskets in the foyer as you leave today. And everyone, of course, is welcome to use our online giving through the app or through our website. And we are grateful that you continue to believe in the mission of this church. The hymn that we just sang speaks of a day that we would gather, as Revelation prophesies, of the river of life in the new kingdom of God, that we would gather at that river. And for any one of us at any given time, that may or may not be something that we may believe actually happens, but there is something also that is true. There is another river, and it's the river of our day-to-day lives. It is the river of the journey that we're on. And this river of following where God is leading and exploring what life is about and what really matters and how we love and how we live. This journey on the river is made so much better as we take that journey together with each one of us. This faith community, as flawed, as broken, as messed up, as many unanswered questions as it raises, it is a journey of a people journeying with God. Enjoy the journey on this river of life as we hope for a better day to come. Go in peace. Amen.